Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 309 of Humanity Rising. Over the last couple of days, we've explored a rather dark aspect of Western culture as we have developed the Humanity Rising themes over the last year and a half. We've taken on almost every conceivable issue, from science and art to technology, culture, politics. And we've focused very recently on the phenomenon of Christo-fascism. That aspect in America, very alive in the Republican Party and alive globally as we witness the rise of authoritarianism, in which we've examined this extraordinary phenomenon of the amalgamation of religious fanaticism and fundamentalism with coercive state power to enact legislation and laws that are contrary to human rights, that suppress people of color, that suppress women. And in particular, yesterday, we focused on the recent legislation coming out of Texas just this last week that for the first time in well over 50 years in the United States, as we've enjoyed the freedom of women to have control over their bodies, since the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade back in the 1970s, the state of Texas has figured out a way to subvert that and make it essentially impossible for women to have control over their bodies, and in fact placed a bounty, a $10,000 bounty that is awarded to people who successfully sue anybody that enables a woman to have an abortion in the state of Texas. And the extraordinary thing about it is that this legislation is being transacted by white men. At the heart of Christo-fascism in the United States is white men. And if you look at authoritarianism around the world, the rise of authoritarianism around the world, it's predominantly male in its ideology and constituted by men in its rise to power. So today we want to look at what it means to be a man, what it means to be male, against the backdrop of some very vicious white male energy in our culture, directed very specifically recently against a woman's right to her own body. And if successful, further repressions are to come. So that's our subject today. What is it to be a man? And what is it to be masculine in contemporary 21st century culture? As you all know, this is coming as part of a series that we've been having about once a month over the last 6-7 months on Humanity Rising, convened by Goodman, who I'll introduce in a second here, but as part of an examination that we feel is very important for us to all collectively consider. Manhood, maleness, masculinity in our time, as we recognize that the last 5,000-6,000 years of patriarchy in our world, in global civilization, needs to be brought to a close. So that's our subject today, and I want to welcome everybody. Before we jump in, let us take a pause, as we always do, and just relax into your body for a moment. Take a breath close your eyes and center your attention on your heart. See if you can listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and thanksgiving that you're alive. Your heart is beating at this extraordinary moment in the human journey. And as you listen to your heartbeat, send love to those you know and to this very fragile world. Thank you, everyone. Now, with a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you, I want to commence our session today by welcoming Lion Goodman, who you all know because he's convened now about a half a dozen panels through Humanity Rising on this question of what we're calling the masculine dialogues. What does it mean to be a man today? What does it mean to be masculine? And this is our next session in a series that's going to culminate between the 15th and the 19th of November, where we're going to have a whole week of masculine dialogues. So this is a preparatory session toward that end. So Lion, welcome to Humanity Rising, and I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Your introductory remarks were so deeply touching. What's happening in this country is scary. And as men, we have to stand strong and we have to stand together to create a new world. So thank you for that potent introduction to this work. This is our fifth panel that we've held at Humanity Rising, focusing on issues of masculinity and manhood. Our earlier panels focused on what it means to be a man of heart and wisdom, what it is to grow up Black inside endemic racism, how boys need to be initiated into manhood, and what women need from men. This panel will be a more open discussion about manhood and man and masculinity, as Jim said, from many different points of view. When men get together in open dialogue, we can use our collective wisdom, which is always more profound and valuable than individual wisdom. Obviously, this is not a new phenomenon. We believe that men have been gathering together for millennia in kivas and longhouses and around campfires, trying to figure out how to improve our lives. Men have been evolving right along with women for about 2 million years or so. And at the same time, pardon me, at the same time, we've been trying to figure out how to create a society and a culture whether it was from small bands and troops of hominids on the plains of Africa to tribes to more dense and organized social structures like villages and then city states and then urban metropolises and vast civilizations. And we humans have been experimenting for many thousands of years with these different social structures and conventions. And every social structure is based on a belief system, which gets passed down from generation to generation. And sometimes we change our beliefs, usually because the old ones don't work anymore, usually because there's a crisis. And we've learned and we've grown over the decades, and we've also gotten stuck with many beliefs and concepts from the past, which we're trying to evolve from towards something better, something more workable, something that makes sense, and that will help us survive our many current crises. So this concept of masculinity and the idea of what a man is has been part of this developmental process. The concepts that we find ourselves stuck with are the result of, up to 10,000 years and 500 generations of the Neolithic era, beginning with the transition from prehistoric hunting and gathering to settled agricultural communities. And then through all of those different structures, that concept has evolved. My contemporaries and I have been trying to find our way together to a new conception of masculinity and manhood. Those old concepts and beliefs didn't work for us, especially in the modernized culture that we grew up in. I've been involved in men's groups and men's gatherings for more than 45 years. Did we figure out a new definition? No, but we did figure out what men need to be healthy. We figured out what questions to ask. We figured out that right answers are less important than good questions. We investigated relationships. How can a man develop a good relationship to himself and to other men and to women and to children and to his community, to the world, to all of our relatives, both human and non-human. We figured out that when we live according to our principles and our virtues and our values and our best qualities, life gets better for ourselves and those around us. We figured out that the old views of men and masculinity and manhood weren't useful anymore and needed to be thrown out. And most importantly, we figured out that we need each other. We need time with other men so that we can heal our wounds and become better partners and better fathers and better brothers and better citizens. We learned how to listen and feel and live a purposeful life. As Jim said, our upcoming program, the Masculine Dialogues, will take place in November over 5 days from November 15th through 19th. With more than 40 speakers and experts, we'll be exploring and reimagining and redefining what it means to be a man in the 21st century. And this program is a launching pad for that program. And the Masculine Dialogues are a preview of our larger program planned for spring of 2022, which we're calling the Global Men's Summit. Both the dialogues and the summit will be a serious investigation and a conversation about men in relationship to themselves and in relationship with each other and with women and with the world. And we're going to include the voices of not only both men and women, but people of many different cultures and backgrounds. We're focusing on practical ways to heal our past and improve our future. I'm really happy to present our panel today. Each man will speak for 3 or 4 minutes to share their perspective on this broad topic of men and masculinity, and then we'll break into Q&A form. We'd love to get your questions on the table, so at any time, please put your questions for the panel or your comments in the chat box, and we'll get to as many as possible when we get to that part of the program. And for those of you who are not with us live, hang on to those questions and ask them in your own community. It's really important to get into dialogue. So I'll start by introducing George Cappanelli. He is the CEO of Age Nation. He's an award-winning author, keynote speaker, executive coach, management consultant. He's helped Fortune 500 companies and government agencies and nonprofits, including NASA and Boeing and Disney and the LA Times, to help them to develop more vision-driven, values-based cultures so they can achieve new levels of success. He's worked with lots of famous people, and he's created this company called Age Nation, whose motto is ageless living. 70 is the new 40, which I like a lot because I'm pretty close to 70. He's made many appearances on Humanity Rising, and we're very happy to have you here, George. So let us hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Lion. It's a pleasure to be here. And also to look forward to November and the spring when we'll have an opportunity to include even more wise and experienced voices on this subject, both male and female. As I was listening to you talk about the improvements men have made, I kept putting the word some of us in front of your statement, because I think when I look around at the world, one of the reasons the world is in such trouble is that not enough of us have taken the journey into exploring ourselves. And even those who have, I think, can still go deeper. I'm reminded of the symposium and Plato's telling the story of human beings originally having 4 arms and 4 legs and 2 faces and both sets of genitalia. And that we were quite arrogant and threatened the gods, and so Zeus came up with an interesting alternative, and that was to divide us, male, female, and send us on our way in search of each other. What always struck me about that piece in the symposium is that one of the searches that we were not apparently encouraged to conduct, both men and women, was to be in search of ourselves. And I think that the principal problem we face today is that we haven't conducted that search. And yes, historical circumstances have changed, yes, social customs and beliefs and all of that. But ultimately, I believe that the more each one of us as men come to know ourselves, come to be able to be in silence with our own soul, come to listen to the essence of wisdom that speaks through our heart, the more we have an opportunity to do some of the things that you spoke about, and that is to determine what our role is in the world, what contributions we can make, how we can relate to our partners, whether they be male or female, how we can relate to the other species that occupy this habitat with us, and how ultimately we can stay in true alignment with the wisdom traditions that have allowed humanity through the centuries to be mindful of the habitat, to protect its resources and be good stewards of them. Clearly, I believe at least those of us who are men contributed to walking off that wisdom tradition path at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And we've been getting further and further away from the traditions that could really support and save us and save our humanity. So I think we have a huge job, but I do think it is a good job. And it is one that in undertaking, we can make a significant difference in mitigating, if not completely resolving, many of the challenges that we face. So that's all I want to say for right now.
Thank you, George. Wise words. I appreciate your wisdom and your centered clarity.
Thank you.
Next, I want to introduce Matt Robertson. Matt, if you've been around Humanity Rising, you know Matt. He is an education innovator and a next generation coordinator for Humanity Rising. He's a mindfulness instructor and an operations manager. Tough to do both at once. He's working at the intersection of contemplative practice, organizational design, and leadership. He supports mission-driven institutions to bring transformational learning experiences to people from all walks of life. Thanks for joining us, Matt. Let us hear your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Lion, and it's great to be here with everyone. I think practicing mindfulness is probably an essential component of being an operations director, but now I get to find myself supporting Humanity Rising and all of the amazing programs coming through Ubiquity. So just wanted to say a bit about the position that I'm approaching these questions from, because I hope to be speaking from my experience mostly during our panel today. I grew up with an upper middle class experience in the San Francisco Bay Area, and found myself quite privileged being able to travel quite a bit, but also facing many trials in life. And this question about gender, masculinity, and identity really started with an experience I had losing my father at the age of 15. I'm an only child. And those questions of what it means to be a man, I started contemplating very early on. And it was in my early 20s that I would say those questions culminated into breakdown and breakthrough. And I began to understand gender and the masculine and feminine energies that humanity partakes in as something that each of us as individuals have access to. Each of us have those two sides of the masculine and the feminine. And I began to understand my identity along a spectrum, where on one side you have this conception of gender, of the masculine and the feminine and the dance between the two, but also on the other side of the more universal, the more spiritual, and how it feels to me like we're in a process where both are undergoing massive changes right now. Our spiritual conception and the expression of gender, masculinity in the world. And close to what you said before, George, that one of the great frameworks that has really made a difference for me is understanding this change from a perspective of ego and separation and a steady identity through time to a more eco perspective, operating within an ecology of life that is always interconnected and always changing in relation to itself, attempting to keep an equality and equanimity, a balance that is necessary for the expression of life on Earth. And so while as human beings, we're all responsible for understanding our ego and reducing our ego, I think that there's a special place for the qualities that have been traditionally masculine to undertake that pursuit, to move towards that mission of ego reduction and allowing the intelligence that is underneath us, the wisdom in our heart, the fact that our bodies know when the heart should beat, when the breath should be taken, to surrender to that intelligence and use those qualities that we are naturally predisposed to amplify and allow that intelligence to flow through us. So the last thing I'll say is probably the most transformational experiences I've had in my life have been involved a feeling of brotherhood, of camaraderie. Having grown up, played basketball, going through a number of different programs, it's always a sense of deep respect and brotherhood that I've had, especially as an only child, with my friends that have been some of the most meaningful connections and relationships in my life. And so I am moving into and asking myself the questions of what role does this ethic of brotherhood have to play in healing the wounds that we're dealing with in today's day and age, and how can we expand our sense of brotherhood beyond the people that are directly in front of us, to widen that circle to include all of humanity that is going through this transition right now. So I believe a new kind of tradition is needed to help us walk our daily path that includes the best of modern knowledge that we've accumulated, but also draws heavily on the wisdom of the contemplative traditions of the ages and beyond in order to navigate our way through this next path. So I hope we can touch on some of those things more during this panel. I know we will. But it's just an honor for me to be here with you today, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to share my experience. So thanks, Lion. Thanks, everyone else, and looking forward to the rest of our day today.
Thank you, Matt. You reminded me of a couple of things. One is the Tao, that when the Eastern view of the world is both masculine and feminine, and they're interwoven, and you need both for the whole. And the idea that we are separate beings, this delusion that we're in, that we're separate from each other and from the world, has really created that ego and created the suffering that we have. Thank you for those thoughts. Next, I want to introduce a good friend of mine, Dr. Tom Pinkson. Tom is a transpersonal psychologist, a consultant, a ceremonial retreat leader, an author, and a sacred storyteller. He's the founder of Wakan, a spiritual and shamanic community in the Bay Area of San Francisco, which I was a part of for many years, a couple of decades. He's also been a clinical consultant for the Center for Attitudinal Healing, and he's an initiated shaman in the Huichol tradition. Welcome, Tom. Would love to hear your views of this topic.
Well, thank you, Lion, and Jim, and all the people who are responsible for making this happen. And it's good to be, even though I'm still half asleep, I had a late night last night with a group with brothers that I don't know, and the opportunity to learn from whatever it is that you share that's already happening. So gratitude for being here. And it's interesting when we were doing the meditation, the heart coherence meditation, and there was a period of silence after Jim's words, and then there was a voice that started to sing. And as I just watched my own experience in response to the stimulus of the song, it sounded to me, I don't know if it was or not, it sounded like a feminine voice. It sounded like a woman was singing. Maybe it wasn't, I don't know. But in terms of my experience, that's what came to me. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. Here's all these brothers here from different places around the world getting together to talk and share our truths about thoughts about masculinity. And we're starting with listening to a feminine voice. And there was the infusion of the feminine energy into the circle of men that we've brought together here, that Lion you've brought together. And so that opened a doorway in my own mind. I didn't prepare any thoughts about sharing today. I just want to be present and see what comes up in a moment. And so that experience of that feminine coming into our circle of males exploring masculinity is very indicative to me of the healing I had to go through as a man, and I'm still involved with, of course, up to my last breath, which is overcoming, dismantling, transmuting the toxic conditioning that I experienced growing up from the culture I grew up in. And that was a culture that was shaped very much by sports. I was very athletic and involved in all kinds of sports. And of course, the ethic in sports was, if you get injured, like playing football, you're hurt, don't be a wimp, don't be a pussy, get back up there in the game and be tough. You got to be strong. That's what men do. And so, of course, there's this suppression of our vulnerability, of our sensitivity that's unique to all of us as human beings, and those of us born into male bodies. But there's the shaping of a false personality, of a false identity that's based on being tough, on being strong. The figures of John Wayne and Gary Cooper, the solitary, strong, quiet hero saves the world and then rides off into the sunset with his horse. Who knows what he does with his horse at night, but that's the way it's taught. That's what a real man does. And to show any sign of weakness or vulnerability is setting yourself up for scorn, for ridicule, for rejection, for being attacked. So there's that part of my conditioning growing up, and that's what it means to be a man. Be strong, be tough, don't show your emotions, don't be vulnerable. That was reinforced by the subculture I was exposed to when I went into junior high school. I was 11 years old, so I was always the youngest one in my class, starting 7th grade, and I was with guys 18, 15, 16, 17, even in some cases 18 years old. This was back in the early 50s. soon after the integration of the schools. And so there were kids going to school who were a lot older, who hadn't been going to school. My first day of school, first week of school, I'm in 7th grade. I'm 11 years old. I'm an innocent kid. One of the older guys pulls a knife on a shop teacher, pulls a switchblade knife on a shop teacher, calls him a motherfucker, and threatens to kill him. I'm 11 years old. I'm in shock. This is the first week of school. There's fights in the corridors. There's fights outside the school. There's fights all over. There's this huge amount of testosterone raised on machismo. And I think to myself, oh my God, man, if I'm going to survive in this, I've got to make myself strong. I've got to make myself tough. I've got to make myself mean. I've got to make myself so nobody bothers, nobody picks on me. So I started lifting weights to make myself physically strong. I started studying boxing. I started studying self-defense and martial arts, about how to be a good fighter. And so that's what I'm raised in. That's what it means to be a man, is total suppression of feelings other than ones that permissionable to men, anger, strength, that kind of thing. So I'm in prison. Like Rajiv said, the most effective prison is the prison you don't know you're in. You have no opportunity to escape from that prison. And I would still be in that prison, which I think is a state of total alienation from the feminine aspect of our own beings. The beauty and wisdom of being in masculine energy and masculine bodies and masculinity. What is millions of years evolution just teach us in the manifestation of our physical body? Men's muscles are different than women's muscles. Doesn't mean women can't obviously get really strong. And of course, there's women who could pick me up and break me in half today. Wonderful athletes, but that male body is made to be physically stronger. What's that for? That's number one, to go out and hunt, get the food, to bring it back to help feed the family, but it's also for protection of life, to make a safe world for the women, the feminine energy, to bring through that life and nurture it, and for us to nurture it with our masculine energy. So there's a sacred marriage. There's a sacred marriage between the masculine and feminine within us. The laws in Texas, the far right, there's such fear of women. I think that's fear of our own relationship with our own femininity, with the feminine wisdom that's inside of us. How did I begin to learn this? Was through going to spend time in indigenous cultures. I was raised in my culture, as I'm sure most of the men my age, I'm 70, I'm going to be 77. The expression when the woman is menstruating, she's on the rag. Oh, she's on the rag. Don't take her out, she's on the rag. You won't be able to get anything. She's on the rag. It was a negative thing. It's a negative thing, part of the masculine machismo conditioning growing up in the subculture I grew up in. Years later, early 20s, I'm spending time with Native Indigenous people on their lands and living with them for a period of time. And when the women come into their menstruation, what they would call their moon, they would go off to a separate setting, a teepee, where there wouldn't be any men. And she'd be relieved of her childhood duties and household duties, and other women would bring food to her. And she could just be with the flow of her blood. She could just be with the flow of creativity coming into her and in her dreams, and pay attention to what was coming through her. The men would then come and ask afterwards, when she came out of the Moon Lodge, about the dreams that they would seek guidance for, masculine and feminine. And the understanding that I got from the Native people was, I'm seeing lying in your face now, so maybe I'm going on too long. I'll finish this up real quick. But I learned from the Native people that the point of taking the woman away from the men for the time she was in her moon was not from the values that I was raised in my culture, the chismo values, of the dirtiness of that, but instead it's because of the power of the woman, the creative power of the woman, and that wisdom that flows through her in her cycles. And so that power could take away power. It could actually weaken the power of the men if it was just not channeled in certain ways. So the women would go off and have their own time for themselves to tune into that power. But there was respect for that power. There was respect for the feminine wisdom. And I think the far right men are so frightened because they haven't been initiated into a sacred marriage of the masculine and the feminine within others.
Tom, thank you. I'm going to close your comments because you have so much to share. And I'd love to have you back for a whole hour because you have so much wisdom. But thank you for this. It's really helpful to get a picture of the native natural culture that's based in nature that contains and thinks of everything as sacred. So thank you for bringing that in.
Right.
Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Jeffrey Noble. Jeffrey is a master healer and a trainer who uses many different healing modalities to help his clients in New York and his New York community to overcome health and emotional challenges. He's an author and a powerful public speaker. He's trained people to heal themselves and each other using the art and science of natural healing. Jeffrey founded the Noble Touch after leaving a lucrative profession to dedicate his life to serving his community and to sharing his gifts with the world. Jeffrey, welcome. Let us hear your perspective.
Okay. Thanks for inviting me. First of all, I'd like to say hello to all the panelists, the guests, and just glad to be here. I think that everyone has to speak from their own experience, which I would do also, of course. I think that when you start talking about what is a male, what you have to consider is where the male was raised, what the male's background is. Masculinity, the same thing. It's just not one answer for masculinity. You have to depend on where your culture, where you were born, where you were raised, how you were raised, as far as whether you were raised in a single household, if it's the woman or father and mother of the household, whether you're middle class, whether you're considered poor or in poverty, all those things matter. So for me, when I heard about the conference of 40 men getting together, talking about to redefine or to define what a man is, I'm not sure that definition will fit across the board. And for me personally, I'm not going to let someone define for me what a man is, what masculinity is. I will define that for myself. I come from being in a place where masculinity and being a male was one thing when I was a young man or a young boy being raised in Harlem in the public housing with a mother raising 4 boys by herself. It was one thing to me being masculine then and being a male as opposed to what it is now. Back then, it was much like Tom said. In order to survive in the streets, you had to fight, you had to be tough, you had to not show emotions. All those things were a necessary part of survival. So masculinity meant being able to, they used to always say, man up, man up, man up. You weren't able to cry, you weren't able to show emotions. You had to be able to defend yourself and your family, especially with no father around. So, but masculinity since then has changed for me. And when I looked at some of the definitions in the book of masculinity, it described my mother. When I looked at things in the book, in the dictionary that described femininity, it described my mother also. See, my mother raised the 4 of us by herself, but she had as much courage as any man did. So I don't think that you could just make masculinity a male thing. We all have female and male energy. When my mother's store was robbed and they put a gun to her head and asked if she was the bookkeeper to open the safe, she said she didn't have the combination. And so the manager opened the safe, he got shot in the head. That could have been my mother. Now, the next day, the very next day, a different guy came in, robbed the store again, came to rob the store again. The question is, why did my mother go to work the second day? She had 4 boys in the house that tried to tell her to not go to work. We're trying to exert our masculinity on our mother. My mother decided to go to work anyway. Same thing happened again. But this time the guy opened the safe, so no one got shot. But why would a woman go to work the second day after someone got shot in front of her the first day? And I asked her later on in life, why did you go? She said, I had to take care of my sons. That's masculinity. That's a male. That's supposed to be a male energy. So what I'm saying here is that we all have male and female energies. But the most important relationship that I have that helped me to create my own relationship with male masculinity or being a male is my relationship with the Creator. Realizing that I am part of the divine spark of the universe. So I don't have to worry about being defined by anyone else. And you look at what's like to be a man, and I mean, what's it look like to be a Black man compared to a white man is different. We talked about the Texas situation where white men decided that women could not have an abortion after 6 months, after 6 weeks, or there's a $10,000 bounty put on their head. White men decided that in most cases, I bet you. So it's a difference even being a Black man and a white man. So we say define male, there's so many different variations of the way you can look at that. For me, Being a male is being in touch with my feminine side and my masculine side. There's a time that I couldn't cry. Because if I cried, I was considered weak and a punk. But now I don't mind crying. I know who I am now. I've stepped into my own power, so I know who I am. It's okay for me to cry. It's okay for me to be vulnerable. It's okay for me to be weak. That doesn't make me less of a man or less masculine. Because in that particular situation, during that particular time, that's how I showed up. And I can show up in my femininity if I want to. I can show up in my masculinity if I want to. I can show up with both open. So we all have both sides of the coins, no matter which one we're showing up with in a given situation. But there's a big difference in the way one man would define manhood, another man would define manhood. And that's why we have to be open to receive men in the way they define themselves and not try to define a man based on your reality. That's what I have to say for that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Brilliant as always. I really appreciate your perspective that you bring, even the conversation about men and masculinity has assumptions built into it. So thank you for pointing that out. Our next panelist is Raji Jayasinghe. Raji is Vice President for Asia for Ubiquity University. He lives in Sri Lanka. Raji has been working in the humanitarian space for many years. He's now teaching a variety of courses on skills to students and corporations across Asia. And he claims to love cricket, video games, and rap music. So Raji, welcome. And please give us your thoughts from your Asian perspective of this topic of men and masculinity.
Thank you, Lion. Thank you for having me here on the panel. Thank you, everyone, for being here and listening to our sharing. When I think about this idea of what it means to be a man, and I'm not going to speak as an expert from an Asian perspective because I'm not, but I speak as someone who's born and raised in Sri Lanka. So just sharing that experience. So what does it mean to be a man? The first thing that comes to my mind, if I'm trying to generally answer that question, is what are the stereotypes that surround the idea of manhood? And I think the easiest way to come up with a quick list of stereotypes is to think about language. What kind of language do we use when we talk about men? One of the famous phrases that we use all the time, boys will be boys. I've heard that used a million times. I've used it myself, and it's a dangerous stereotype because it normalizes a lot of negative behaviors, which are not inherently manly behaviors, but they are normalized because of the stereotypes we hold. So I'm talking about things like heavy drinking, even alcoholism, right? It's in Sri Lanka, it's what the man is expected to do. He goes out and has a bottle of arak with his friends every evening. Violent behavior, right? This manlyhood that Tom was even talking about, right? That's almost expected behavior. That's not acceptable. These are kinds of things we have to shed. The idea of womanizing. That's, again, so much inappropriate and unacceptable behavior gets passed off during teenagehood and even later in life, just with the simple adage, hey, boys will be boys. That's how deeply entrenched this kind of thing is in certainly this part of the world, and I'm sure in other parts of the world too, right? Locker room talk, supposedly acceptable. Think about some other phrases. I think Tom actually mentioned a couple. I was thinking of just be a man. Man up. Big boys don't cry. Right? That's really everything that some of the other panelists were talking about. Men are not expected to show emotion. In this part of the world, a lot of the time, men aren't even really expected to be part of the arts. Men who join theater and song may be looked at slightly differently. And then you have this idea where the men that don't fit in, right, who don't fit these manly stereotypes, start to experience a lot of insecurity and uncertainty about who they are. And that can lead to mental health issues. So that's a completely different consequence of all this. So people that don't fit into the stereotypes. If you look at language, I mean, you see the case of Afghanistan, and I'm sure there are other countries like this too, where you have a heavily authoritarian, man-led regime, which a lot of the time uses religious text to justify what they're doing. That's how deeply entrenched some of these behaviors are and how they have not been updated with the times. And so, we could come up with a number of these sorts of phrases. And just to end my remarks, one phrase that came to mind, which is not a famous one, it's off a very silly Russell Peters comedy sketch. And the sketch itself is not important, but it's between two people at a marketplace negotiating for a price. And one guy says, hey, give me a good price, be a man, do the right thing, right? And the whole joke is around that. The context of the joke isn't important, but the phrase, be a man, do the right thing. Now, for me, that's a good one. Because when I think about being a man, like Matt said, and for most of us probably, we think about our fathers. And when I think about that, I think about a man who did the right thing. Honor, self-sacrifice, hard work, compassion, service, loyalty. And when you think about those traits, those aren't man traits, those are human traits. And I think that's basically the conclusion that I came to is I think that we are transitioning, and I think it's happening. That's why we're having discussions like this one, leaving the old tropes behind. And I think hopefully sooner rather than later, coming to a point where we are having a panel discussion about human values, not men versus women. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Lion, for the time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Raji. It's wonderful to hear from our younger compatriots who are growing up in a different environment. They're growing up more awake than we were when we grew up. We were fighting our programming, many of us, that we got over decades and out of our culture. And people like Raji and Matt, who are younger, in the younger generations, are in a different world. They're in a different mindset. They're looking and seeing how stupid we've been for carrying on these traditions. Someone used the term locker room mentality. Thank you for your comments, all your comments in the chat box. I've been reading them. So the first question I want to start with, and Jim, I'd like to bring you in as our first answerer. Two questions, really. When did you realize that you were stuck in these old beliefs or concepts about masculinity and manhood, and how did you step out of them? And the second part is, who are the most influential men in your life, and what did you learn from them? And could you have learned the same lessons from women? So that's a lot of questions, but Jim, I'd love you to start the discussion off with your perspective.
Thank you, Lion, and thank you all for splendid definitions of maleness. What was coming to me was that Paulo Freire's term, the pedagogy of the oppressed. And I think what I'm realizing more and more is that the traditional notion of patriarchy, that men were superior and the women were oppressed, needs to be revised to an understanding that men and women have both been severely repressed as a result of a system that we call patriarchy, that put men on top, as it were, but actually it's a deeper repression. It's a deeper coercion of the human soul that has been in its own way as corrosive on the male side as on the female side. And I think that's part of the liberation that I've been experiencing as a man, realizing, as has been shared over the last few minutes, that I was as enslaved in my own way as the women were, and just in a different category, but in an equally debilitating corrosion of the soul. And to fight one's way out of that in our time has been spectacular. And for me, Lion, I was raised in a Christo-fascist setting in a missionary school out in the island of Taiwan, and severely disciplined, and my manhood was originally sculpted by my refusal to submit. And I had to develop all kinds of survival strategies that turned me into an alpha male, just by the nature of being in battle. And my transformation, I think, began in my late teenage years, during my college years, taking psychedelics. It was my first experience realizing incontrovertibly that the world was not what I thought it was, that the world was infinitely malleable, and that the psyche and the body were intertwined, and that the illumination of the soul could change attitudes and change behavior. And that was probably my opening, was through psychedelics. And in some ways, I've never looked back, and I still have a lot of male tendencies, but I think they've been ameliorated by a deep appreciation of the struggle that both men and women need to engage in to find liberation. And I think one of the most exciting things happening in the world today is the gender and sexual fluidity that's happening, because for the first time in thousands of years, men and women can explore all aspects of what it means to be human, and therefore what it means to be masculine and feminine, in a worldview now that allows both sexes almost equal access to both genders in a way that is idiosyncratically aligned with each individual. That's a beautiful, beautiful future to embrace. As to the men who have had the most influence on my life, I would say my father. My father was an upright man, and who taught me the virtues that to this day sculpt my character. There have been other men subsequent to that. One is my mentor while I was at Cambridge doing my PhD, Eric Hutchison, who was a Jungian analyst. And it was my first experience with any kind of analytical work. And for about 7 years, every Sunday night, I would go to Eric's house and have dinner, and then spend the rest of the evening in deep work on my tortured soul, seeking liberation. And so that was another man that was powerfully present in my life. And I just would close by just saying, in reference to my manhood, I always remember the words of Chekhov, that it's drop by drop that we squeeze the slave out of ourselves. And I think our generation is that generation, maybe the generation before us, but certainly ours. And now the Gen Zs and the Gen Alphas and the millennials coming up the other side, we're those cluster of generations that has this extraordinary privilege of squeezing the slave out of ourselves and becoming the kind of human beings that were there all along, but were unable to come into the fruition of full potential.
Wow. You're a tough act to follow, Jim. Thank you. Thank you for those words. You reminded me in answering my own question here that my father was a gentleman. He was an artist by sentiment, and and everything was gentle. So I learned to be gentle. And then my first girlfriend in college was a feminist. And I thought that was a good idea. I'll become a feminist too. And the really great thing about becoming a feminist at that time was that it got me very close to other women. So I had a lot of women surrounding me. So I had as many women teachers as I did male teachers. And of course, psychedelics also, opened up the possibilities of what was real, and everything could be questioned. We used to have a button that said "Question Authority," and that was that squeezing the slave out of us. That was a great metaphor. So, George, I'd like to bring you in and ask you this question about, who are the men that influenced you, and when did you realize you were stuck in old concepts, or did you ever?
Well, I think I'm still realizing that and still working at it. I think the biggest wake up was when I left home. I grew up in a somewhat traditional Italian family, and I was a prince. I thought I could do no harm and that everything that I did was just wonderful. And then when I started going out into the world, some of my first teachers were women or girls at the time who corrected a lot of that misunderstanding about my privileged stature and the fact that I could do no harm. And I think it's been a continuous journey since then. I've just been so blessed with both men and women, older men and women as my teachers. My father, also was just a good man. He was a good, decent man with values that I still hold, that I think are really terrific. The ethic of work and responsibility and a striving for excellence and a commitment to the well-being of other people. Those are all things that I got from my father, who was humble and a decent man. And other men that I've known, artists that have helped me with my art, and writers who have helped me with my writing, and like you, Jim, a Jungian analyst who helped me rethink aspects of my world. But all along the way, the litmus test was in my relationship with women as well as with men. Could I collaborate? Could I cooperate? Could I understand? Could I accept and allow? Could I admit my vulnerabilities? Could I learn? And those things continue to this day. But one thing I also want to say is I'm hearing an undertone that we are wrong, that we were broken and now we're on the way to being fixed. I feel differently. I believe that we were what we were in the historical times and frames that we were living in. The values that we practiced were not juxtaposed to the consciousness that many of us now hold as good, as uplifting, as awake, as inviting, as compassionate as they can be. But we also are the products of different historical times, those of us at least that are in the third chapters of our lives. So I want to look back on those times with the ability to accept, the ability to forgive, and the ability to make change. But I don't want to feel badly for who I was rather than who I am. I want to use that to learn every day, to use that as another form of litmus that says to myself, how am I measuring up to the new beliefs? And like both of you, psychedelics and various plant-based medicines had a lot to do with teaching me that there was a significant difference between what I thought was reality and the other forms of existence, the other states of consciousness that lie just there on the other side of that permeable membrane. But I want to be proud that I am a man. I want to be proud of the stumbles I've taken, the falls, the wounds, and the breakthroughs and the victories. And I think that combination of energy, that combination of perspective can help us in the next stage of this journey. And I believe that although those men and boys who are younger and in other generations who are not as encumbered by some of the same beliefs that I have and have worked through, they still have things to learn from us as elders. They still have perspectives. So I want to honor that, and I want to celebrate it, and I want to share it.
Thank you, George. I want to acknowledge there's many wonderful questions in the chat box, and we will probably not be getting to any of them. We have, how much time do we have left? I think about 15 minutes or 30 minutes, Jim?
20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. Well, somewhere in between 15 and 30, good. So this is a really important dialogue, and we want you to be sure and come to the masculine dialogues in November. Because this is a beginning. All of your questions are so important, and we just we have so many ideas we want to get to. So forgive us if we don't have if we're not able to get to your question. There was a really good question in here. How can we educate the men who are not in the men's movement, who are following their fathers and their grandfathers' view of the role of men in society? How can we reach the men who are trying to control women's bodies and the men who are after power and wealth and don't want to share it? You know, what can we do as men to help others awaken to this new world that we're talking about? Do we as men have a unique task to do that? It's like, is it our job? Is it whose job is it? Because clearly it needs to happen. Jeffrey, let me bring you in for this question.
What's the question again, Lion? How do we reach other men or men in power?
Yeah, how do we reach the men who are not awakened yet? How do we awaken men? Is it our job to awaken other men? How do we reach out to the people who are in power, politics, controlling women and the rest? What's your idea about what we can do as men? And is it our job? That's really the question.
Well, I think that number one, how do you identify those people? You can't just, go to every guy and ask them that question. There's to be a way to identify them. There probably isn't a way to identify them that I can think of anyway. Number two is, if you do identify them, how do we convince them? I mean, you may not be able to convince them, and that should be okay. I think the best way to do anything, in my opinion, is to lead by example. If you start a big enough movement of people doing things and lead by example, then they may want to join. But if you go looking for them individually and try to find men to bring into the fold, that may work also. But I think the biggest thing to do is to always lead by example. As far as the politics and the people in power, why do I want to give up my power? If I'm sitting there with all this power, why do I want to give up my power to join your movement? What's in it for me? So you look at those people who are in power and who have influence like that. You have to figure out what's in it for them. How are they going to benefit from joining our movement to make them more aware? They're already aware of what they want to be aware of, and they may not want to lose. And that new awareness that we're trying to bring may make them believe that they're going to lose their power, and therefore they may not even be interested. So once again, the main thing for me is to lead by example. If there's enough of us leading by example of what it's like to live and awaken to life, that may entice them. Hopefully that will entice them. The men in power, what's in it for them? Why are they going to leave their position of power and political influence to join our movement? What's in it for them? That's the way I look at it. By the way, I'm interesting. I keep hearing you guys talking about psychedelics. I never tried psychedelics, but you're making it more and more interesting. I've never had a smoke or a drink or even a beer in my life, in my entire life. So I've heard from my millennials that I talk to all the time, and they talk about psychedelics and things. But now I'm hearing you guys that are about a little younger than me probably talking about psychedelics. Maybe I need to at least listen to them more. Tell me about psychedelics.
Well,
Yeah, Jeffrey, let's talk.
let's get together over a beer.
Let's get together. What are you doing this
Plant
weekend?
medicine.
My millennials will kill me if I do it with y'all first. The millennial group that I have in the Noble Touch, they will kill me if I do it with anyone else first, but we can talk.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Tom, I'd like to bring you in to answer this same question. What can we do as men? Is it our role to convince other people, to change other people, or do we just change ourselves? And Tom, if you get closer to your microphone, we'll be able to hear you better.
Okay, thank you. Well, I agree with Brother Jeffrey when he talked about modeling. The most convincing statement of what we believe is how we live. And so the saying that all of us have heard about from Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world. Or if you really believe in something, you don't just talk about it because it's easy to move our lips up and down, but you live it. You live the values that you believe are important to live, such as love, kindness, compassion, generosity, beauty, respect, justice, that you live that. And in all of our relationships, all of our interactions within ourselves, actually, and with others, excuse me, we're either coming from fear or we're coming from love. And love is the essence of our being. So when we interact with people that have the far right or whatever, if we demonize them, we don't see on the spiritual level how we're connected, but their strategies of what they're doing is trying to meet needs. All their strategies are trying to meet needs. And underneath the strategies that are hurtful to other people, to people of color, to indigenous people, to the earth, to animals, there's the same basic human needs for respect, for caring, for belonging, for a sense of meaning in your life, meaning of purpose in your life. So we all have the same basic needs, including the need, if we want to fulfill our highest potentials, to create a sacred marriage inside of us, the masculine with the feminine with the masculine, the yin with the yang, to heal the illusion of separation, bring all of those forces together to be able to produce what they can't do separately. So I think change comes from how we live. Instead of coming from the perception of fear and demonizing the other who's different, trying to see the places of connection in terms of meeting our needs, and how might we be able to meet our needs collectively, cooperatively, more responsibly to ourselves, to our children, to animals, to life, to the sustainability of life. And that comes through respecting our common humanity, respecting the truth of our interconnectedness, that the perception of separation that ego identify is such a strong component of, creates the competition, creates the negative judgments about the other that's different from us or stands in the way of getting what we want. So I think the opportunity is men to use our strength as men to create that sacred marriage inside of ourselves. And by the way, I want to give another plug that's been echoed here for psychedelics. A key opening for me in that hard shell I built for myself was taking psychedelics out of respect with elders who passed on right relationship of working with those plants that come from Mother Earth, that opened me to the feminine within myself. And for my own healing, I needed to make a sacred marriage of respect and cooperation with that part of myself. And then to live from understanding how we're all connected, to live from love, to live from respect, and try to make that connection with others that are different in our common humanity. Be the change we want to see in the world. All right.
Thank you, Tom. Raji, I'd like to bring you in and give you the microphone about this question. So any of these questions, there's so many of them. So please give us your thoughts.
Thanks, Lion. Just, I'll touch on a couple of things that you asked about. The first thing you asked about was being stuck in old concepts or in old traditions. I think that particularly applies to this part of the world, certainly to Sri Lanka. I mean, we're about 5 to 7 years behind when it comes to the kind of progressive movement that Jim was talking about. But we are getting there. I think that one of the reasons we're stuck in there, or stuck in these traditional roles, has a lot to do with context and has a lot to do with options that people have to be able to change the way that they see themselves. So, for instance, I used to do a lot of work in the war zone in Sri Lanka, in the IDP camps, and it was, it was literally a war zone. There were bombs flying over our head when we slept at night. In those kinds of situations where men have very specific roles, it's very difficult to break out of that tradition. And you can imagine, even 10 years after the war is complete, a lot of these traditional roles are seriously entrenched in society. Now, that's an extreme example, but you could take it all the way down to peer pressure at school within a group of boys. The point I'm trying to make here is related to what Jeffrey brought up, which is, how do we change this? Is we lead by example? Yes, we do. But the insight I wanted to stress was that by leading by example, what we're doing is we're giving people who are stuck in those traditional roles, we're giving them options. We're showing them that it's possible to be another way and still be successful and valued and worth something. Because I think that sometimes in our culture, we're so tied to what we think a man is, that if we're not that, we think we're being unsuccessful or that we're not worth something. And that happens a lot in school. If you don't behave like the rest of the boys, you get kicked out of the group. So I think that by showing that I can be a man and I can also be in theater and I can also sing a song and I can also love another man, and show that life is possible, it gives young people an option to defect, so to speak, from the framework of values that they're trapped in at the moment as a result of social, cultural, societal norms. So I think I'll leave my comments at that, but that was just a little insight I wanted to add to the lead by example point brought up by Jeffrey. Thank you.
I love that, giving people the opportunity to defect from the values they're trapped in. That is a great phrase. Make a good book title, Raji, if you're ready to write a book. Matt, we haven't heard from you for a while, so please come and share your thoughts about this complex topic. How do we get people unstuck from the beliefs that we're stuck in?
Yeah, I'd like to say a little bit about a couple of the questions here. I've been so inspired, echoing so many of the points that have been brought up. I think what's coming up for me strong here is just again, I have to emphasize the intense energy of brotherhood that can cut through so much of the noise. They say don't bring up politics at the dinner table or something like that. We're all human. And I like to believe that we're all doing the best we can within our current understandings, and to connect with someone on that level that recognizes that we're all in this together. We may be in different places in our journey of understanding and awareness, but to recognize that no part of that journey is easy. And to have that compassion as a foundation. In the Shambhala tradition that I practiced, they would call it basic goodness, relating from a place of basic goodness that recognizes the humanity in someone else. And to answer your question specifically, Lion, I don't think that it's our job to wake up other people. I think it's our job to use our privilege and the power that we have in the systems that we exist within towards the good. But it's also important to recognize that people are on their own journey. And there's nothing that I can say to convince someone that their understanding is incorrect. Change has to start from within, a desire to change internally. And to bring up, George, what you said about not wanting to feel bad about where we are at certain parts of the process, I think is a critical ingredient to walking this line, to normalize that we're all on a path of increasing understanding and we're all at where we're at, but we're all on the path together. And to normalize that, I see that a lot in my meditation practice, where people think the whole point of meditation is not to think and not to have thoughts arise. And so whenever thoughts arise, there's, oh, I'm not doing it right, and it's this martyrdom that, to be quite honest, I don't think we have time for. We don't have time to feel bad about ourselves and where we were any longer. It's time now to do the work, to be realistic about where we're at, and to do the work. And part of recognizing that we're in this together was also mentioned earlier about the intense desire to belong. I think when I was growing up, that was a huge part of imprisoning myself within what I thought were the masculine stereotypes, was my desire to fit in and be included in our larger human family that just happened to be existing at that level at that time. And the process that allowed me to move out of that, while it doesn't sound fun, I think at its most basic understanding is the experience of pain and suffering. Suffering is part of the human journey. One of the noble truths that the Buddha talked about, and our relationship to our own pain and suffering, Tom, I think is part of how we make that sacred marriage within ourselves. Is pain and suffering something that we run away from, that we numb to ourselves through all kinds of doors of compensation, to so to speak, drinking or being lazy or numbing out to TV shows or whatever. The question is, do we have the courage to face the transformative energy that is always within us? And in the theory of change that I've been exposed to, it's said that the desire to change has to impose itself on the center of your consciousness. Things have to get so bad that you look for any way out. And it's from that place that one then becomes open to creating new habits and ways of life. And so I'm not sure we'll get to this question, but some of the most important men in my life have been the men who have been able to face their pain and therefore hold space for me to face mine, to hold me while I cried, has been some of the most transformative experiences in my life, and resulted in some of the deepest respect I have for other men in the world, where they were able to show up and love me unconditionally while I faced my own pain, and for them to let me know I was not on this journey by myself. So I think, and feel that as men, we're conquistadors. We want to go out and take over and expand. And it's this growth mindset, of more is always better. We're entering an age now where I feel that there is no more. We've reached our limit. And now we're here to hold, not expand, but to hold space, hold the space that we've come into and created for the modern world. And that's one of the most powerful ways we can also show up for our counterparts, for women and the feminine energy, is to hold that unconditional space of love and ground for the wisdom of the feminine and the intelligence that energy represents into whatever's coming next, which I think is unknown, that we have to, we will become it when we let it through, but we have to hold that space and container open of the good in order to give it a chance. And I'll end there. But that thing sums up all of the things that I think came up during your shares. So thank you, everyone. That was very powerful for me.
Yeah, Matt, that was a great summary of so many of the important points. And Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. I wish we had about 8 more hours to continue this discussion. So many good questions that we had prepared, and so many good questions from the folks that are here. Thank you all for being here. Jim, I'm going to hand things back to you for a summary. I wish we could ask each man to summarize their thoughts, but that would take another half hour. There's so much richness here. I really want to get you all to come to the masculine dialogues in November, because we will have time. There will be 10 sessions of Humanity Rising, one in the morning, one in the evening, for 5 days in a row, where we can go deeper and we can have a much more elaborate conversation. It takes time to talk through these things, and I wish we had more of it. So, Jim, would you like to come back and give us a summary and wrap us up?
Thank you, Lion. And thank you, gentlemen, for a splendid, deeply insightful collage, I would say, around one of these profound questions that have as many answers as there are people reflecting upon them. You know, what is man? What is masculinity, particularly in our time? And so I want to acknowledge that, and to say, because of the importance of this issue, as Lion said, we're going to be dedicating Humanity Rising during the week of November 15 through 19 exclusively to these questions. And we're going to be having 2 sessions each day. So we'll have 10 sessions in a 5-day period that will be convened on some aspect of masculinity in our time. And we'll be having women involved, because we believe that the perspective of women on men and masculinity is as, if not more important than what we men think. So the masculine dialogues in November will be, in many cases, led by women, so that we can get a full spectrum of insights into these real issues. I think the closing image that I would like to provide for us was actually touched on by Matt. You know, where Matt, you made the comment that, you know, change imposes itself on us. And I think that's a very important thing for us to note. And it took me immediately, Matt, back to Plato's allegory of the cave. You know, men, women, Chinese, Arabians, Latinos, Caucasians, whoever we are, we're all in a cave. And it's dark. We see dimly in the back of the cave things moving around. And we don't turn around, and we don't see that other people, the elites, the people who control culture, are flashing images on the screen before us, and we're told that that's what's real. And we have shackles on our hands, and we have shackles on our feet. And then all of a sudden, something happens, says Plato. Some desire for change imposes itself on us. And we look around, and for the first time, we see the sun at the mouth of the cave. And once we see the sun, we look back on our shackles and we realize that nobody put the shackles on. We put them on ourselves, thinking that the shadows at the back of the cave are real. And we stand up, we walk to the mouth of the cave, and we see the sun and the beauty of the world for the first time. And then said Plato, we have a choice. Do we just stay outside in our freedom? Or do we go back into the cave to liberate our fellow human beings who still think that the shadows are real? And I think this allegory of the cave perfectly encapsulates the struggle of men and women in our time to free themselves of the shackles that have kept us enslaved. And part of what we're doing through Humanity Rising, and part of what we're doing just today, as we try to do every day, is to bring a little more light, to enable all of us to wake up a little more. Because as the old saying goes, no matter who you are and when you started on this path, we all have the same distance to go. And that's the challenge of our time, in community, to wake up together and affirm life anew in ways that human beings, I don't think ever in our history, have been able to do with such global extent and such futuristic possibilities, where everything has been called into account. Everything is molting with novelty. And we are the carriers of this future every day. So I really want to thank all of you men today for the deep humility with which you've approached the questions that Lion has put to us. And we'll have one more session in October, and then we'll have the full masculine dialogues in November, as I said. So thank you all. Then tomorrow, everyone, we're going to turn to the issue of public health. That's also been a meta theme since the beginning of Humanity Rising. One of the greatest impacts of COVID-19 has been on our mental health, our mental and emotional and psychological stability under increasingly severe stress. So the Nordic Health Alliance and the European Health Futures Forum are convening a panel on how citizens and public officials can begin to come together during this time of COVID to think through with fresh eyes, how do we secure the public health of our citizenry at a time not only because of COVID, but because of the increasing ecological turbulence all around us. We're all stressed today in ways that we have never been stressed before. And it's going to get worse. That's what climate change is all about. And in the middle of all this, we have to maintain our psycho-emotional stability and capacity to deal with constant change and increased turbulence. So tomorrow's session is an important session for how citizens and public officials come together to even talk about this. It's going to be a very important session. So we hope that you'll join us. Thank you all once again for this time on Humanity Rising, and we'll see you here again tomorrow. Bye for now.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Lion.
Thanks,
Thank
Jim.
you, George, Tom, Jeffrey, Matt, Raji. Great session.
So much, guys.